That was Shinzen Young, Buddhist. I have to say, Phil, we've had some pretty amazing people on the show. Not to pat ourselves on the back, but he was a guy. He's like 14 years old, and he decides he wants to learn Japanese. Goes to Japanese school. Goes to college, learns Chinese, learns Sanskrit, then goes to graduate school. We didn't even get into this with him today, and he
Yeah,
meets somebody who's a Buddhist monk, and then he goes spends 3 years in a monastery. Then he meets a Catholic priest who's into mindfulness. I mean, what a life! What an experience!
I
And like he
know.
said, he was growing up in the '50s. There was no talk of any of this at that time, and I should say for our listeners. Phil, you chronicle this movement of knowledge from east to west in your book, American Veda. But here's a guy who really lived at the time when huge transition was just beginning, and he was at the forefront, and just an amazing life.
Yeah, and to be honest, what I chronicle in American Veda is sort of the yogic,
Hmm.
you could say Hindu equivalent. I didn't cover Buddhism in the same way because that had been done before by uh, excellent historians and writers who covered the Buddhist piece of the story, but I do cover it to some degree. So he is kind of the Buddhist and Japanese and Burmese equivalent of what many of us experienced when we were drawn to the Vedantic and yogic teachings that stayed in India. But together, it's quite the phenomenon. But you're right. I mean, most of the people we know got into Eastern practices and Eastern philosophy in the 60s.
Right.
When what we think of as the counterculture exploded, but he was way ahead of that
Yeah.
game. And I
Very,
mean,
very. Yeah.
I'm his contemporary, and when he was getting into Japanese, all I could think about was baseball and girls,
Right.
and
Right.
I didn't know anything until 10 years or maybe 8 years later. So
Yeah. It all started with him watching a low-budget samurai film, and it went from
yeah,
there. One thing I did mention to him during the interview is, for some of our listeners, it's almost overwhelming. He covered so much material in regard to
yeah,
the different traditions and all. But I like how he summed it up, and he said, "Look, if somebody comes to me and they want to learn meditation, I can teach them the different skills, the concentration,
yeah,
contemplative part of it, transcendental part of it, and if they want to be a better tennis player, I'll give them the skills to do that. But then I think he put it in terms of happiness. I'll show them
yeah.
greater degrees and greater depths of happiness and the five aspects of happiness. So I'm sure he's a wonderful teacher and probably in that Zen tradition, very patient about how he introduces knowledge to the student.
Yeah, and he sounds very practical. This link between these ancient teachings and the modern sort of pragmatic approach of science and doing what works and what's evidence based, makes a tremendous amount of sense. And you see it both in the world of that has come from Buddhist practices, what people think of as mindfulness, and you also saw it, with yogic forms of meditation, and now various techniques of hatha yoga. The more science examines these things, the more mainstream they can become, the more applicable they can become to different teachers.
Hmm.
I mean, different segments of the population. But what he's doing, and his answer to the question of is anything lost when you mainstream or secularize these things, is very parallel to the conversations going on in the yoga world and the
Right.
world of meditation, where the critical thing, most people who care about this agree with is he used the word upaya, which means skillful methods or skillful means, and being skillful as in teaching these practices to the public would suggest speaking to people at the level of their interest and what they can hear, and then at the same time giving them a vision that there's more to it.
Right.
There's more available should they want it or when they're ready for it. And I agree with him that that's the best thing to do rather than wring our hands and complain
Right.
about this.
No, I thought he brought that out very well. And it's not just in the world of spirituality and spiritual traditions that this happens. Take for instance jazz. At one point
Yeah,
people said, "Oh yeah, this is a small core of people who really understand and dig this music," and now these guys are going out and they're making it like pop music, and they're not secularizing it, but popularizing it, and the same sort of complaints and concerns. And you can have both. You can have people that practice yoga to look good on the beach and whatever, whatever, and other people that practice it to become, to know God, to become
yeah,
enlightened and all that. But I
that's
think
right.
eventually, if you're doing a practice correctly, you'll go into it more and more deeply. And we're seeing that. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, Phil, was, and uh, I'd be curious, maybe we could have somebody come on and speak more about this. You mentioned about the research that's being done, and I know a lot more research is being done on mindfulness practices now. And I think it was Paul Mills was on our show, who's a professor at University of California at San Diego, and also the head of research at the Chopra Institute. And he was mentioning that mindfulness meditation, there's an enormous body of research that has been done and is
Yeah.
going on now.
Yeah, there's a lot in recent years, and a lot of that has to do with John Kabat-Zinn, who adapted essentially Vipassana meditation, and
Hmm.
probably the most important person in coining the term mindfulness and popularizing it, and um, and also the conferences the Dalai Lama has had with
Right.
scientists and his great popularity and his name. So this is, to me, this is recapitulating what happened in the early 70s when Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was as famous as the Dalai Lama is now, and he was encouraging
Right.
research into his TM practice and meeting with scientists and all that. So both what we think of as Hindu-based forms or yoga-based forms and Buddhist-based forms, there's an enormous body of research now
Right.
on both of these trends,
Right.
and people are now, distinguishing among different forms of meditation, different forms of mindfulness, and it's eventually we'll have a really solid grounding in evidence.
Right. Right. And Phil, I correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't you a subject on one of the first?
I was.
I mean, a major study, a breakthrough study, maybe what
Yes.
put meditation on the map in the Western world in terms of it was
Yeah.
Scientific American, I think, right? Harvard University
What
researcher.
one of those? Well, I mean, the history of the TM research back then is the first study was done by Keith
Keith
Wallace, who
Wallace,
we both know and who has been on the show,
terrific
and
guy.
he did his doctoral research on the physiology of
Hmm.
transcendental meditation, and then he collaborated at the invitation of Herbert Benson at Harvard Medical School. And I was, an early meditator living in the Boston area, and they asked for volunteers at the Cambridge TM Center, and I volunteered. So I
And
was one of
produced
the.
results, and produced significant results.
Yeah, I meditated with a blood pressure cuff on in a cubicle in Harvard Medical School.
The rest, the
Who
rest is
knew?
history. Yeah.
They didn't even pay us.
Well, maybe you'll get a back check that can collect on that one.
Yeah, yeah,
Anyway,
that's
so
great.
more on that, and yeah, I would enjoy having Shinzen back on because
Yeah,
he can go into it with such that depth and detail, and he really is a pioneer. And we've had many of the pioneers in you mentioned Keith Wallace and many others
yeah.
in
Well,
spirituality
one
in
of
the
the things I
West.
appreciated about Shinzen is many people in the Buddhist world are part of one particular lineage. They're Zen teachers, or
Right.
they're Vipassana teachers, or they're disciples of a Tibetan Buddhist teacher, and he seems to have a broad base on the full range of Buddhist practice. So I would encourage anybody who is interested to listen carefully and re-listen to this interview, because it was kind of, in many ways, Buddhism 101.
Right.
I'm glad we had him on, because Buddhism, we didn't cover that very much up until now.
We will do more. So,
Yeah.
folks listening in, go to our website, spiritmatterstalk.com, where you probably are now listening to this, unless you're at SoundCloud or iTunes or wherever else you might find us. And please send in any suggestions, contact us, things you like, don't like, suggestions for guests. We got some great folks coming up. And please tune in and tell your friends about us.
All righty.
All right, till next time.
Okay, Dennis.